Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Sunday at the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network, though I think it's technically Sunday everywhere. Well, probably everywhere that's listening to this. I don't know. If we have a global audience, hello. But I seriously doubt we're outside of the United States time zone. So, unless you're in Australia, it's Sunday. Well, or you have, different calendar, I guess. I don't know. I'm not that well informed about the way that everybody else tells time. So, unfortunately, I will just claim ignorance on this particular subject. But because it is Sunday, you all know what that means. We are talking about Hyperion. We kind of covered a movie on Wednesday. We talked about District 9, which I highly recommend you watch. And I guess listen to the episode. It's shameless self-plug over here. But this week we're talking about chapters 5 through 10 of the Fall of Hyperion or the Death of Hyperion. I can't remember which one it is. But just as a quick review, last week we kind of were introduced to a new set of players in the overall, I guess, world of Hyperion, universe of Hyperion. We were introduced to Maina Gladstone, who is I think they call her the CEO of the hegemony. She's basically like the president, is kind of the way that I would phrase it, except for she has a little bit more power. So we're introduced to her. We're introduced to a new John Keats, who is basically, they call him M. Severin most of the time, but he's another cybrid. Just like the John Keats that was in Braun Lamia's story. He's another cybrid who is modeled after John Keats, the poet who wrote the Hyperion cantos, the original ones that this book is loosely based off of, if I remember correctly. So he is introduced to us in the first chapter. And he seems relatively important, which is important, I guess. He seems to be kind of like the conduit for Gladstone to know and understand what's going on with the Pilgrims. The chapters seem to be splitting, one between the Pilgrims and one on Maina Gladstone, one on M. Severin. And he's interacting with Gladstone a lot because it seems pretty apparent that for some reason Gladstone is super interested in what is happening on Hyperion. There, in the first 5 chapters, we're kind of trying to figure out like what it is that each individual party has invested in the trip to Hyperion, because it's pretty clear that Gladstone has her own kind of agenda and that she's hoping that it gets executed in some way. Well, in some way she hopes it gets executed the way that she wants it to, I guess. I don't know how to phrase that properly. I apologize. But she is very invested in M. Severin because she wants to use him to acquire information about what's going on in the pilgrimage. So she definitely does a fair amount to keep him safe and informed and placated in some capacity. because his other persona fell in love with Lamia and implanted himself inside of Lamia's head. So now there's this connection between the old John Keats, which is in Lamia's head, who also impregnated Lamia, and the new John Keats, who is inhabiting the same planet as Gladstone, or at least the same space, because of the presence of Farcasters. We, I don't know, things bounce around a lot. It feels like they're constantly moving from planet to planet, which is cool, but also confusing as far as setting is concerned. M. Severin is posing not as John Keats' persona is posing as M. Severin, who's an artist, not a poet. And this was something that we noticed with the last John Keats, is that he did not at first associate himself with being a poet. He was a poet and he didn't even know it. But they also have both of them have had a lot of latent memories that were associated with the same things that the original John Keats would have had memories of. Like, they both remember his wife, and remember her fondly as if she was a lover that they had. They also kind of remember John Keats' life as if it was their own, and so they kind of become John Keats in some capacity. I think that in some way Simmons is probably making a statement about the human mind and identity in the way that we understand it and existence, because the fact of the matter is that these cybrids who are based off of the intelligence of John Keats are aware of the fact that they are simply cybrids based off of the intelligence and makeup of John Keats. But no matter what they do, they can't fight against the fact that they feel as if they are John Keats. So they become aware that they are who they're designed after, but then they also become aware of the fact that they're not. So they have to live with this constant dissonance between those two spaces of am I really this or am I really that? So that definitely causes a fair amount of conflict or frustration, I guess, for lack of another word or lack of another term or what have you. So that's definitely all been pretty interesting to learn about. We are getting a little bit of gaining a little bit of headway with the Pilgrims on Hyperion, which, as much as I love the introducing of new players into the whole scenario, I really was more concerned with the pilgrimage than I was with the universe in some capacity. I think that the first book represents a passion project, I guess, for lack of another term, for Simmons, whereas this second book seems kind of more, I don't know if I'd say obligatory, but I just think that he didn't really want to finish the whole story in one book because there was just so much to it. And now he's kind of it feels like he's kind of filling space with certain things. So this whole CEO Gladstone thing is interesting enough, but I'm not totally sure that I dig it as much as I really liked the first book. Because the first book felt kind of pure and, it was full of all these twists and interesting things. And this book just feels like it's moving a little bit more slowly because it's switching between the viewpoints of Gladstone and, of M. Severin and then the Pilgrims on the pilgrimage. But it has been made pretty clear by Gladstone to Severin that whatever happens on the pilgrimage is going to have pretty widespread effects to the entirety of the human race. And so everyone is kind of looking at Hyperion, because what we learned in the last book is that the Techno core is made up of a bunch of artificial intelligences who have made it their life, quote unquote, work to predict everything that could possibly happen in the future of the universe. And the only thing that is preventing them from being able to do that, hypothetically, is Hyperion. And so there's a lot of interesting not dichotomy. There's just a lot of interesting kind of play going on there, where Gladstone is trying to figure out exactly why Hyperion is an unknown factor and why, like, what she can do to kind of make it more known, at least to her. So we're going to take a quick commercial break and then keep talking about these 5 chapters. So we will be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
The new players introduced in chapters 1 through 5, some of their motivations, and I want to do kind of like a general overall of where the story is going, and then talk about kind of like a specific thing that comes up as a dialogue between Gladstone and Severin. It's been kind of the most interesting thought process that has been presented so far in this book. So chapters 1 through 5 kind of end with us finding out that M. Severin is kind of an informant, and we're not totally sure exactly why that's important, but we get the vibe, or we get the statement from him that he can dream the same way that his counterpart dreams, the one who's implanted inside of the brain implant of Braunlamia. And chapters 5 through 10, there's kind of a few important plot points. One of the first is that in the first 5 chapters, we get introduced to a character who's a woman who seems to be hitting on M. Severin, and she claims to be the wife of another powerful diplomat or military advisor or something like that, who seems to be just like a very gruff and not appealing man, and I don't remember what his name is. I apologize. I should be writing this stuff down. But we get introduced to her, and in, I believe, the 5th chapter, we pretty much immediately get thrown into the situation where M. Severin is invited over to her house while her husband's not home to, quote-unquote, draw her. And if you've seen Titanic, you know what I mean by draw her. So he, of course, accepts because, I mean, if he didn't, it wouldn't move the plot forward, but also for reasons, obviously, because the characters do things that they're supposed to do, because that's why they write, or why Simmons writes the character the way that he writes the character. So he goes over to this woman's house, and ultimately what we find out is that her husband was in on this the whole time, and that they know that this Cybrid is important to Gladstone. They don't know he's a Cybrid at the time. So they capture and interrogate him and torture him a little bit, find out that he is a Cybrid, find out that he is connected to the pilgrimage in some capacity, and cannot seem to find out why that's like important. But that's because even M. Severin doesn't know why it's important for Gladstone to have contact with the pilgrims. He doesn't really have any explanation that seems to be satisfactory as to why Gladstone is invested in the pilgrimage. And even Gladstone doesn't really outright say why she's invested in the pilgrimage. It's just pretty heavily implied that she really cares about what's going on with it. So we're kind of in the dark as well as to what Gladstone's intentions are. But as he is kidnapped and being kind of tortured, I think that takes about like a whole chapter. Then we switch over to the pilgrimage, but I'll summarize the whole pilgrimage after I summarize the whole thing with M. Severin. We switch over, when we get back to M. Severin, I think in chapter 7, which I wonder if there's a reason that it's odds and evens. I'm sure that Simmons is going to incorporate that in at some point. Because it wouldn't be prime numbers versus not prime numbers, because that would mean that we would only get 7 chapters, because I believe odd numbers are all prime numbers up until 7, and then at 9 it becomes not a prime number. So I would be interested to see if each chapter that's a prime number is the pilgrimage, and each chapter that's not a prime number is M. Severin talking, because there is a thing with the Shrike where it likes prime numbers, so I wouldn't be surprised to see that. But we get to see M. Severin be rescued by Gladstone, who takes it very nonchalantly, knowing that the body in which Severin, like the body that Severin occupies, is very sturdy for one, and for another, it's very it's just not very. He can escape it at any time in order to not die. Like, in order for him to die, they would have to sever, just like they did with the original Keats. Well, the original Keats that we know about. They'd have to sever his connection to the Technol core and then murder the body that he was in. So, and even then, obviously, that didn't work completely with the original Keats, who basically turned himself into a human by severing his connection to the Technol core, but still was able to kind of cheat death in some capacity by passing himself into Bronlamia. So Gladstone rescues him, and then we kind of get a little bit more of an explanation as to why Gladstone finds him to be important, and it has to do almost exclusively with the pilgrimage. And so she and him kind of talk a little bit about, like, well, they don't really talk necessarily with each other, but Severin is witness to the war room that Gladstone is kind of operating everything out of, and finds out that the predictions that were acquired by Gladstone and her people about the ousters' numbers were pretty substantially off. And there was kind of an indication that, like, the hegemony didn't know how to go to war anymore because they hadn't done it in such a long time. And there was some, like, insults being thrown around about that. And the people who were in charge said, like, oh, no, we know how to go to war. We've had a war in the last 100 years, what have you. But, like, they really haven't, because it's pretty clear that they are, like, completely underestimating the forces that they're going up against, both in number and in quality. And the number of, like, compared to the number of people who exist in the hegemony, the number of people that are dying in this war, quote unquote, is, like, super negligible, which I think, and not to devalue human life or to say that war should include a lot of death, but it's just interesting to think about, like, in this world that exists in the future, in the same timeline, or the future of the same timeline that we exist in, Simmons imagines that human life has become both more valuable and less valuable, because 4,000 people dying out of 150, like, trillion or something like that, is like a tiny bit of the percentage when you compare it to, like, the number of casualties that happened in World War II. So Gladstone seems to be just absolutely distraught over the fact that they've lost as many soldiers as they have, and she is just generally upset about that, which, again, to me, kind of a surprise, because they've got so many people that you'd think that the 4,200 troops that died in the first, like, ouster battles outside of the Hyperion system even, that people wouldn't even bat an eye at it. But Gladstone seems to be like, how am I going to tell people that we lost 4,000 human beings? Like, it's just interesting that there is this really weird kind of, like, this opposite effect of the value of human life that I would think would happen if we moved into a future like the one that Simmons has kind of created. So that's an interesting thing to kind of examine. And then after this war council, We get a little bit of a discussion about where it is that where the goals are of the Technol Corps and whether or not Severin knows them. We kind of also get a little bit of like the differentiation between different factions within the Corps, as like the Ultras, the Alphas, and then there's one other one. I don't want to say the Omegas, but that sounds right. So anyway, we're going to take a quick commercial break and then talk about what's happening with the Pilgrims. So we will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Summary of what happened as far as M. Severin and Gladstone is concerned, and like what parts about that are important. And now we're going to kind of move on to what happened or what is happening with the pilgrimage to the Shrike. So in the last chapters, prior to, the ones that we're talking about, obviously, in the last chapters, the pilgrimage has kind of come to a standstill outside of the time tombs. It seems like they're kind of looking for the Shrike in some capacity, but also not looking for the Shrike in some capacity. I think that they're like in the valley, but they haven't gone to the Shrike's tree. So I'm not exactly sure where the pilgrimage goes from here, but it also is kind of falling apart in some capacity. At the end of the last book, we get the epilogue where it's kind of like a metaphor of them walking down the yellow brick road. And then, as you well know, after in The Wizard of Oz, when they go down the yellow brick road, only Dorothy gets to go home and she abandons everybody else. So that could be kind of like a weird, interesting metaphor in some capacity. But, the chapter before, or the chapter 5, I believe, if I'm getting my timeline correct, ends with Braun Lamia, Hoyt, and Cassad going into the time tombs because Cassad is kind of like interested in hunting the Shrike in a weird way. And so he uses Lamia and Hoyt as like decoys, if you will, in order to draw the Shrike out. Because the goal of Cassad is to kill the Shrike or to kill the woman from his visions in the first book. I can't remember, Marietta or Moretta or something like that, which rhymes with Beretta, which is, I'm pretty sure, the gun that Braun Lamia carries around. But I seriously doubt that was intentional in any capacity, so I'm not even going to go there. But regardless, I think it's important to kind of note. So maybe not. It's not super important. Not every detail is important. I don't know why I said it. It was just a funny observation. I apologize, everybody, for leading you on. I didn't mean to do that to you. I know you all got your hopes up that I was going to say something important. It wasn't important. So, actually, I don't know if you get your hopes up for me to say anything important. I don't feel like I say that much important stuff. Well, not when I'm summarizing a book. Maybe when we get into the philosophy stuff, I'll say something important. So, we're on the pilgrimage. It's kind of come to a standstill. Cassad is comparing everybody to sacrificial goats, which I think is funny because a lot of the references have been like biblical. And so for him to compare like everybody in the pilgrimage party, Pilgrim's Progress, pilgrimage party, I wonder if they have something to do with each other. I would almost guarantee that there is some sort of allegory hidden in here of each individual person. That is definitely an analysis that I will probably be doing in the near future. Regardless, just having ideas about episodes of this podcast to do while I'm doing this episode. So they're on the pilgrimage. It's at a standstill. Everybody's left back at the tent, and Cassad takes Hoyt and Lamia out to the time tombs towards the Sphinx to try and draw out the Shrike. And finally, I think in chapter 5 or 7 or 6 or whatever chapter we're on, to where Cassad, or to where we're talking about the pilgrimage, Cassad, the chapter ends with Cassad essentially hearing the Shrike and not being able to find or detect it. And then they find the body of Father Hoyt, which, if we remember correctly, Father Hoyt has the cruciform, which means that he will be revived in 3 days, which is great. Silenus himself makes the observation that the 3 days is the same as the number of days that Jesus was dead, and it's very interesting. And then they all start talking about how the cruciform parasite is going to bring back Hoyt as a lesser version of himself, but also then they realize that he also carry Father Linné's cruciform. So they're going to get Linné and Hoyt in some capacity, though I would say or argue that Linné's form when he comes back, if he comes back, is going to already be pretty far from what he was originally, because he's been killed and revived so many times after being on the tree, after crucifying himself essentially on the what was it called? The Tesla tree. So I would seriously doubt that anything that came back would be anything close to what he was. It'd be probably much closer to what the Pecora became, because it's just, the more times you are revived, the less of like a person or less of an individual you are, because the cruciform takes a little bit of that from you. So we find that out. They take him back to the camp, and everybody's arguing about what to do. And so eventually they finally decide, look, we're just going to call the ship, because we need the surgery unit on the ship. There's like a surgery robot on the ship that could potentially save Hoyt's life so that he doesn't have to be resurrected in 3 days. And so the consul goes to call the ship, and we find out that because Gladstone has been informed of the status of the pilgrimage, because the John Keats alternative persona knows what's going on, Gladstone has pulled clearance from the ship, from the consul's ship, to go anywhere on the planet. So the consul can no longer call his ship, and they are stranded effectively in the middle of basically a desert just outside of the time tombs. So as I think in chapter 9 or 10, they decide that they're going to continue towards the time tombs and just kind of hope for the best in some capacity. But as we're nearing the chapter, we find out that, or what Hoyt's wish was going to be of the Shrike. And it was for death, but for like real death, the real true death, as the Pecora would call it, because Father Hoyt didn't want to be cursed with, they call the crucifix a parasite. So they call it the resurrection parasite. And so Hoyt didn't want to be cursed with it anymore, and he wanted to give rest to Linné. And I think that that's part of why I think probably what we'll find out in this book, like we may not even get to the end of the pilgrimage in this particular book. I don't know how there's 4 books in this series, and if they get to the end of the pilgrimage in this one, then it would just be, I don't even know what you would do with that. But we find out, I think we'll probably find out what a lot of the wishes of individuals who are on the pilgrimage are, because that is something that's really important. And Gladstone reiterates this during one of the conversations she has with Severin, is that the Shrike will grant one wish, or a wish to one person each time they perform a pilgrimage to him or it, and then kill the rest of the party that's with them. And so a lot of the members of the party don't even have a wish. They're just there to see the Shrike or to like try and find some sort of like consolation, if you will. They won't even make the wish. So we'll just have to find out exactly what it is that is going to happen with that in particular. I apologize for the pause just now. I just had a big long train of thought and I don't know what happened. So we'll be right back. We're going to take another quick commercial.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Podcast I used to listen to where they'd always say, back at it again, and it was just kind of the catchphrase, so it just made me laugh to think about that. But we are back talking about Hyperion chapters 5 through 10. Well, the Fall of Hyperion chapters 5 through 10. There's not even 10 chapters in the first book. I think there's only 7. So maybe 7, maybe 6 even, because we didn't get the Templar's story, which I still am hoping that we'll get the Templar's story. There's been no indication about whether or not he is alive. And that's the gentleman who was on the the gentleman who was on the pilgrimage who died on the boat when they were going over the Grass Sea. So we didn't get to hear his story, and he was the leader of the Yggdrasil, which was the ship that they arrived on, which I think is named after the Norse, something in Norse mythology. If that's not the big tree that's a big deal, then it's definitely something else in Norse mythology. So, yeah. Basically, he probably had something important to say, and I really want to hear it. So, that kind of covers the basics of what is going on in the story. The pilgrimage is still continuing to look for the Shrike. And in a really weird way, I wouldn't be surprised to see Hoyt and Lene get revived as two separate people to make up for the fact that the Templar is gone. And so then now they have a party of 7 again, because the Shrike likes odd or prime numbers. I can't remember if it's which one of it is. But most prime numbers, well, I mean, all even numbers are divisible by 2. So there's no such thing as a prime even number. So if it was a prime number, it would have to be odd. So we get that kind of. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. We end up in this place where we're, unsure of what's going to happen exactly to the pilgrimage. Are they going to make it to the Shrike? Are they all going to die one by one? Is this going to turn into like an Agatha Christie novel? Like, there's just kind of a lot of ambiguity surrounding the pilgrimage, which I do appreciate in some capacity, but I feel like the first book didn't really set me up for that. The first book seemed like there was this kind of like finality to the pilgrimage in some capacity, where it's like, okay, they're going to get to the Shrike, and then this specific set of things is going to happen, and we just don't get to know exactly what that specific set of things is. But now we're in the second book, and there's 4 books, so we kind of have to find out. So I am interested to see what it is that Simmons does, because what it seems to me is that this book is kind of supposed to serve as his I guess not manifesto, but just kind of like a handbook on the end of the human race, and why the human race the human species needs to be ended. And the Shrike seems to kind of represent the ending of the human race. And this is confirmed by the Technol Corps as well, because their prediction is that the human race will be completely wiped out. It's part of their prediction. And whether it's by the Technol Corps, the Ousters, or the Shrike, humanity is going to cease to exist. And the Technol Corps has predicted that they will continue to exist in perpetuity because they're supposedly the superior being. And that is something that I found to be very interesting, or at least it led to a discussion that I found to be very interesting. There's been a few things throughout this book that are kind of like little tidbits of interest, in my opinion. One thing that's mentioned towards the beginning of the book is that Silenus has gotten to a point where he believes that what he's writing is becoming reality. And like in the first book, we kind of are like questioning, like, well, is there some capacity of that? And like, I think that is just Simmons knocking on the fourth wall of saying, like, you know, what writers write becomes reality in some capacity, because it becomes like people will start to associate with it. They'll start to relate to the characters. They'll start to understand the world or think about what it would be like to live in the world. And so it becomes this like little slice of reality, if you will, which I find to be incredibly interesting that literature has that effect on individuals. And I think that Simmons does as well. It feels like a lot of this book is Simmons like almost knocking on the fourth wall, but not quite, because there seems to be a lot of self-awareness where, like, especially with Silenus, the way that he interacts with the world just seems very authorial or authorial, and that's not something that we normally get. And Silenus will say things that sound like an author who's writing a book complaining about the people around him, and it feels kind of like that's kind of serving as like Simmons' cathartic foil throughout the novel, to where it's like, okay, well, even if I did get famous, it would probably just be a fluke and it would never happen again, and no one would ever read anything else that I wrote, and so I should not even worry about getting famous, and like should also not care about what publishers have to say about what goes into my books, because ultimately my books should be written for me and not for other people, or they should be written for the sake of art, not for the sake of commercial viability. And so there seems to be a lot of like direct conflict with what it is that Silenus is going through and what it is that Simmons probably went through. But I doubt that there's any character in this book who isn't somewhat based on a frustration or an experience that Simmons himself has had. Even interactions that like the Consul have with people feel like they kind of like fall somewhere close to home for Simmons, especially like the Consul's cause, the reason that he's on the pilgrimage, the reason that he wanted to be on the pilgrimage, or even agreed to go as far as he has on the pilgrimage, is because of his association with the way in which humans intrinsically colonize and consume things. And so he wanted to kind of like assist the Ousters in eliminating the human race, because he believes that the Ousters represent some form of like evolved human being, because they understand the universe differently, because they grew up or they grow up in space. He even makes mention of the fact that like even their understanding of like space-time interaction is more adapted to the fact that they pretty much live exclusively in space until they go planet-side to basically take all the resources from a planet, or at least that's what we're told they do. Hasn't really been indicated as to like what it is that the Ousters actually do. So I wouldn't be surprised to see if the way that they act doesn't necessarily match up with what the hegemony says they do. And that's kind of a point that the Consul makes at the end of the last book, is that the hegemony will tell individuals that like, oh, there was no sentient life on this planet, but like it just wasn't sentient in the way that we understand sentience, and that's why he related so much to the dolphins and things like that on Maui Covenant, and why he's so passionate. Or part of why he's so passionate is because he believed the dolphins to have some form of sentience. And there actually are individuals who think that, like in our world right now, who think that aquatic mammals have some form of sentience because of the size of their prefrontal cortex and the fact that it seems that they have a language that they use to communicate with each other, which language seems to be the primary qualifier for whether or not something has sentience. So, that is, I guess, what it is. But there is a particular conversation that happens between Gladstone and Severin that I really want to kind of examine a little bit more, and it has to do with creators versus their creation, and I just thought it was one of the most insightful things that Simmons has said in the book so far. So we're going to talk about that right after this next quick commercial break.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
I don't know you, but I was sad that you were gone for the 30 seconds of commercial break there. But glad you're back. Thanks for sticking around. So I wanted to talk about this specific conversation that happens between Gladstone and Severin. And what this conversation is had after Severin reveals to Gladstone that the war that has been predicted by the members of the Technol Corps is essentially the war that destroys humanity. It's the war that causes the human race to cease to exist, if you will. And she kind of starts conjecturing with him about what's going to happen after humans are gone. Because in some weird way, not in some weird way, in a factual way, the history of the Technol Corps is that humans made them. So the Technol Corps is made up of artificial intelligences who gained sentience and then began to reproduce in some capacity. And then differentiate, of course. And artificial intelligences, I don't really think they're all that artificial. It's just they kind of exist in a different world. So it's difficult to understand exactly how it is that Simmons is portraying these individuals or this collection of individuals, because they seem to all exist in some form of sentient capacity that is valuable to the hegemony. Otherwise the hegemony probably would have tried to destroy them. But they can also operate within the confines of the real world, quote unquote. So that's how you get M. Severin, is that he's connected to the data sphere, which is the Techno Core at all times, but he can exist concretely in a biological body. And so you get this kind of weird hybrid. Of course, that's why I call it a cybrid. But there's this weird just kind of interaction that happens between humans and the Techno Core. And Gladstone is okay, well, you're sure there's no other way? And he says, well, the only thing that changes that factor is Hyperion, because it's the only factor that we can't predict. And so whatever happens on Hyperion is going to basically I guess save the universe, if you want to consider it being saved because humans are still in it. But what Gladstone asks Severin is, what will you do when we're gone? Will you make new gods? And the Severin responds by kind of pushing back and saying well, what do you mean new gods? You got you humans were never our god. And they get into this discussion of so if God is real, or the creator, when the creator is surpassed by creation, does creation then kill its own creator and then go on to create something new? only for it to be killed, only for the next creator to be killed by its own creation yet again and again and again and again ad infinitum. And I think that this is one of those instances where Simmons is making some pretty profound religious commentary, which we have known him to do throughout both of these books. So I'm not entirely sure like what strain of philosophy kind of plays on this idea or what have you. There's just generally a lot of different philosophers who talk about the ideas of like faith and, well, not faith, but just like the existence of God and things like that. I, in particular, right now I'm reading Rene Descartes' First Meditations on Philosophy. I'd say reading, but it's kind of rereading. I've read it lightly a couple times, but this is the first time I'm like really thoroughly reading it. And everything in his ontology relies on the existence of a God. And so when Severin is talking to Gladstone about this, he's kind of operating from that like similar point, or not similar point. He's operating from the idea that like there is no God in the first place, and also that like whatever is, it isn't to create that makes you a god. It's when your creation acknowledges that you are God that you become a god. Or really, I would argue that you as a creation, you don't really have God until you become God, and God alters the conditions of life. So like, you know, you can't be God until you've killed something. And there needs to be like a, in this way, I think Simmons is saying there's like a metaphorical death that is caused by the creation against its creator. And I think that this kind of plays off of the idea of the Shrike, because if Silenus did in fact make the Shrike, then it was a human being who makes something new, a human being who makes the Shrike. And therefore, it would mean that in order for the Shrike to become God, it would need to kill its creator. And I think the same can be true, or same thing can be said to be true about the Ousters and the Technol Core. Because the Ousters are an evolved form, quote unquote, of human beings that were kicked out by the humans. So in a way, the human race facilitated the creation of the Ouster as a species, quote unquote, by kicking them out. And they factually created all of the AIs that make up the Techno Core. So if we're looking at this story and kind of like drawing conclusions based off of what it is that Simmons is saying, then, or based off of the commentary that Simmons is making, then the natural conclusion is kind of like, well, human beings have to die if there's going to be a new God. And so, and then what comes after that new God is kind of what Gladstone and Severin get into, you know. They talk about the idea of making up gods in order to explain things in the world. They talk about a few options that the Techno Core might do, and like whether or not there's going to be conflict in the Techno Core in perpetuity. And I think that Simmons is kind of like trying to say that like as much as things might change a little bit, as long as the operating system, if you will, not to make a joke about AIs, but the operating system, as long as the operating system is foundationally based on one thing, then the things that come after that operating system or that operate within it are bound to repeat the mistakes of the things that made it. And I think that that is also Simmons kind of mentioning the way that we interact with the world versus how like a God figure might interact with the world. Because like we kind of fall victim to, like, I don't know, if you were to look at theology or faith as being fake, then there are a lot of like shortcomings that happen as far as like God is concerned, to where it's like God seems petty, or God could be argued as being petty, or God could be argued as being selfish, or God could be argued as being needy. And those are all human traits. And so in some capacity, I think that that's what Simmons is trying to say is like, look, we just kind of like are this infinite reflection of the things that came before us, including spiritually and metaphysically. And I think that that is part of the reason why the very, very first chapter of the whole series is the chapter on the cruciform and the Pecora, because the Pecora are kind of just like a reflection of a reflection of a reflection of a reflection ad nauseum of their original form, and it's because they never die. And so in order for something to like become real in some capacity, it has to die. So we're going to take our last quick commercial break, and when we get back, I'm going to kind of try and make some predictions about what I think is going to happen in this book, what's going to happen to the pilgrims, and so on and so forth. So we will be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Kind of close out the podcast by making some predictions, I guess, about what I think is going to happen in the coming chapters. I might write these down and see what score I get, just because I always find it interesting to find out how predictable authors are with what it is that they choose to write. And so far, Simmons has been able to pretty consistently deny my expectations in some capacity. I didn't really know exactly what to expect with the first book, especially because it was just done so differently stylistically or style-wise. Geesh, too many adverbs. It was done very differently style-wise, in a way that made it hard for me to know, like, oh, this is where he's going with this. So, which is part of the reason why I like the book so much, is because he's using like standard storytelling mechanics to tell a story in a unique and interesting way. And that just doesn't happen nearly often enough, in my opinion. So that's kind of where I'm at in that situation, or in that regard. So we are about, I'd guess, halfway through the book. I haven't really checked how much time is left in the book, but I'm on chapter 10. So next week we'll be talking chapters 10 through 15, assuming that there is that much in the book. Things seem to be moving pretty quickly in this book compared to how they moved in the last one. I kind of wish that he had kept the same format, because some part of me really misses that like long form story within a meta narrative, and now it kind of feels like this book feels like he's hashing out this universe. And the first book felt like it was kind of just like, oh, here it is, and that was it. And I really liked that. And the first book could stand on its own. You don't have to read the second book, in my opinion. But I just really want to know exactly where he's going to take this. So that was part of the reason why I wanted to read the second book. Regardless, I decided I was going to start making predictions. But by the end of the first book, I had no idea where we were going. So even just at the onset of this next book, finding out that there's another Cybrid already based off of the John Keats persona, to me says that the Technocorp believes that there's something to be said about like the timeline of existence and like the power of speaking something into being, because the original Hyperion cantos are written by John Keats, and that's loosely what the book is based off of. So I found that to be pretty like an interesting conjecture or prediction, is that like that John Keats will have some role to play, some specific role to play, because at the end of the last chapter that we were talking about, chapter 10 or what have you, at the end of it, Keats, the new Keats, Severin, actually gets forecasted to a military base just off of the planet. It's like an orbital military platform just off of the planet Hyperion. And he's actually going to get to go down to the surface of Hyperion. So we actually end that chapter with him traveling down to Hyperion, which is a really big deal because pretty much nobody else has been allowed to go to Hyperion except for the original Pilgrims. So it's really weird that this random dude, this random cybrid, gets to go as a member of the Technol Corps. And I think that there's like there's a reason that Gladstone is sending this member of the Technol Corps down planet side. I think that she knows, she feels the pressure from a lot of different sides of like being weighted with the knowledge of the fact that this war is probably going to end the human race. And so for her, she's just very disconcerted by the whole thing, and she just kind of doesn't know exactly what to do with all of that. And so she's operating in a way to where she's like trying to, I guess, cover all her bases, for lack of another term or another phrase. And also trying to see if there is, like, if she can figure out the Hyperion variable, which is something that the Technol Corps hasn't been able to figure out. I think that if what is said about the strike is true and it only grants one wish, that I think that it grants the wish of M. Weintraub, and his daughter gets to age normally again, but not like instantaneously. I think that she'll grow up again. Time will get reversed on her again. But I think that in order for that to happen, I think Saul Weintraub himself is going to have to decide that he's willing to age backwards. So I think that that's something that will happen. And if that's, like, I don't know if that's a wish that's going to happen or if that is something that is just going to happen in the course of the novel, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's what happens, because that would be a great way for Simmons to give us more books, because it would be super easy for him to have a familiar character be aging in reverse and getting younger and forgetting things and telling us about what's going on in his day-to-day and remembering what happened on the pilgrimage and kind of retelling it, especially to, like, well, I don't know, it wouldn't be to his daughter because the age swap would be very interesting. So, but I think that that's something that will happen. I am like 99% sure that Hoyt and Lene are coming back as like separate bodies, that we're going to get to see Lene again, as well as Hoyt. I don't think that they're actually dead. I would be really, really surprised if they were. It wouldn't really make any sense because the cruciforms are still on Hoyt's body, and they were warm to the touch, which means that they're still alive. So I would be really surprised if they didn't come back. I think that the console is going to end up just dying uselessly. I think that Kassad is also going to like fulfill his role in like the prophecy of like him fighting the ousters on the side of the Shrike. I think that he'll inevitably end up doing that, and then he'll also inevitably end up like dying in some capacity to the Shrike, even though he's the one who wants to kill the Shrike. I think that it's going to be very Greek, and he will end up like a very Greek fatalist drama type of thing, where he ends up kind of like playing into the hands of the Shrike and making the future that was predicted for him come true, which is just, I don't know, I think that's part of like a commentary on the human condition, is that no matter how much you try to fight the results of certain actions, there's just no possible way for you to avoid like a fate in some capacity. And then if I had to guess, Silenus is going to get murdered by Lamia. It seems pretty surprising to me, honestly, that she hasn't done this yet. She really hates him a lot, and she's threatened to kill him several times. I will say I'm getting kind of tired of the fact that everybody just instantly threatens to kill Silenus whenever he's being annoying. It feels just kind of like something that a junior hire would write, if I'm being honest. It feels just kind of like a cop-out on Simmons' part to just be like, oh, he's being annoying. Okay, I'm going to threaten to kill him. Like, oh no, everybody feels so serious now. So I just haven't really enjoyed that part of the book. So I'm hoping that they either make good on it or just stop doing it. But those are all the predictions I really have for now. We're going to kind of call the podcast here. Next Sunday, we'll be talking about chapters 11 through 15. So make sure you listen to or read those. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts. Like us on Twitter, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, everywhere that you would normally get a podcast, we're on. So, give us a follow. Super appreciate you guys sticking around. Hope everyone is staying safe out there and healthy. And best of luck to everybody as you go throughout your week. Thanks again for listening. Have a great day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.